Welcome to your first application module. A couple of notes before we get started. The first is that while the key commands that I use will be shown on screen as I use them, some of those keys will be my own customized versions of the commands in question. I chose to leave those custom commands in place rather than using the defaults because I feel that it makes sense for me to show the potential of using those types of custom setups in making design work more efficiently. However, I will try to always identify these early on in order to avoid confusion on your end. Secondly, you are about to notice a distinct drop in the quality of my verbal presentation during these in-app modules, which is because they are mostly unscripted. It's okay. We'll get through this together. Let's do it. Hi there, and welcome to your first application module. As you can see, there are a number of differences. Number one, I'm wearing glasses. Number two, the video quality is much poorer. And number three, there's going to be a lot more ums and ahs because this is all unscripted. Right behind me is, well, hold on one second. There, that's better. So up here is my screen, so you can see what I'm doing. Then we've got to my right is the module and section information that shows you where we are, what we're talking about. And then directly above me is the legend that shows you the symbols that appear whenever I press keys such as the control key, or the option key, or the command key, or the shift key. Now, one note about the key commands that you're going to see popping up on the screen, as I had mentioned in the introduction, they're not always going to match up with what the default keys are for the application that we're talking about. I leave that in place because I want you to see the actual fluid design stuff in action. I want you to see the way that I have improved my own work setup for the way that I work. But I will try to always preface the usage of any of those keys in advance so that you're clear on what key command that you need to use to enable the same function. So I'm going to show you a really good example of why it's important to do that. So I'm going to make a selection here with the marquee tool. Now, I don't like to see these edges. When I have something selected, whether it be paths in Illustrator or paths in Flash or a marquee selection in Photoshop, I need to have things selected, but I don't want to actually see those marquee edges. So I'm frequently in the habit of hiding my selection. The way that you do that by default is to hit Command H. And you'll see, it goes away and comes back. This is the normal way you would do that. That's fine. It's not the end of the world. And I actually did do that for years. But finally, I woke up to the fact that I could remap that to my F1 key. The F1 key is really close to my left hand. So I don't really have to take my hand off the keyboard or go looking for a key or anything like that. I just quickly hit F1 all day long over and over. And it makes it a lot faster. This is something that I do hundreds of times a day. And so it saves me a lot of time to be able to use that. Now you may notice that I'm talking kind of fast. That's not just because I'm jacked up on coffee. It's also because Photoshop is a really rich application and I happen to know more about it than any other design application. But also because we have a lot of introductory stuff that we're covering, such as the introduction to this whole interface and that sort of thing. So I'm going to be trying to blast through as much material as possible because I don't want to have this module be overly long. But if there's anything that I blast through that you're not clear about, please pause the video, rewind the video, go back and check it because all this stuff is important, I promise you. Okay, so on to our first actual topic, which is the palette arrangement. Now, I did not get the memo on Adobe's official switch from the term palette to the term panel. I'm probably going to use those words interchangeably just to make this as confusing as I possibly can. In any case, normally, I'm working in a dual monitor setup, which is not really feasible to show you in this particular context. There's not enough screen real estate. But I will show you what my dual monitor setup looks like. And this is what I would see on my main screen, which is the monitor that would be plugged into my laptop. I want as much of that screen devoted to just the canvas as I can get. All the palettes are located on the laptop monitor. And as you can see, this is basically customized to take advantage of the massive amount of space that I have just for my tools. This is not uncommon, of course. A lot of people use dual monitor setups, and I am a big proponent of it personally. Because I have, I'm a major layers user in Photoshop. I really want this palette to be as big as it can be because some of my PSDs will have dozens, if not over 100 layers in some cases. Now we're going to switch over back to Photoshop, and I'm actually going to do something that I never do, which is switch to the default setup, the default workspace. If you are an experienced designer, if you have started to really get the hang of Photoshop, there's really no reason for you to keep using this, because you will have developed your own way of working. You will figure out the tools and palettes that you make the most use of. Those are the things that you need to be really present really easily, really quickly. So I think a workspace like this is a great baseline to get started with, but by the time you're taking this course, it's assumed that you have some experience under your belt, and it's time to move on. So we're going to move on by switching back to my single monitor workspace. And here again, you can see that I've got a very tall, large layers palette. My algorithm for working on any workspace really, but especially with a single monitor setup, is that I want as much screen real estate as I can get devoted to the canvas while still having one-click or two-click access to the tools that I use constantly, that I use the most. So that's why everything is set up the way it is. I do use channels pretty frequently, but not as much as layers, so they're buried behind the layers palette. I do use the text palette constantly, info palette tools. I don't actually have a huge amount of palettes here because I don't use the other palettes that often. Now, one thing that I really have to give credit to Adobe for is the fact that the whole palette and workspace system has evolved tremendously over the years. It used to be that you kind of had to just put these palettes beside each other and try to arrange them the best you could, and there was no saving that arrangement. Unfortunately, Adobe saw the light and they really started making this stuff not only such that you could save multiple workspaces if you wanted to, but also the sheer flexibility of the way that you can use these palettes is really impressive. Because now not only can you stretch and change these palettes and group them together, but you can also attach them to each other. You can sort of glue them together. You can glue groups of them together. You can glue them to the left and right sides of the screen. You've probably seen this maneuver where you pull it over the side of the screen and it gets stuck over there. All these things are terrific. They work beautifully. Now, the last thing I'll say about your workspaces is that a really good way to go about creating a workspace that's tailored to the way that you work, if you've never done it before, is to pull them all out onto your screen. Get every single palette out, take them out of their groups, make sure you might need to make them as small as you can just for the time being so that you can get them all onto your screen. Go into the window menu, make sure all of these are clicked on. And when you do that, it gives you a couple of things that you can do. One is that you can learn more about palettes that you might have either forgotten about or didn't know about to begin with. And then it also allows you to start turning off the ones that you know that you either never use or rarely use, because those don't really need to be a part of your regular workspace. And after that, start looking at the ones that you actually do use on a very regular basis that you want to have constant access to. Use those as the anchors. Use those as the panel or palette that's going to be front and center, going to be out in front of you at all times. And then the ones that you use a little bit less commonly, those you can group behind the anchors. And you put it all together, change the shape, that sort of thing. Anchor it to the left or the right side of the screen, whatever the case may be, and just keep playing with it. So I just encourage you to start playing with your palette arrangement. Find one or two arrangements that really work well for the way that you work. So we're done with palettes. Let's move on to modifier keys. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about this because you should already know most or all of the basic functions with regard to the modifier keys in terms of like document navigation and that sort of thing. And B, those that you don't know, you can easily learn on your own. You don't need fluid design to do that. There are a bajillion tutorials out there to teach you about, basic uses of Photoshop. So we're going to start by blasting through a few of those basic commands that you should still be slapping yourself for if you don't already know these things. Starting with spacebar to move your canvas around. And then we've got command space to bring up the zoom tool. Command option space to zoom out. Using shift to constrain your selection. Using the command key to temporarily bring up the move tool. There is absolutely no reason that you should be using anything but the modifier keys for these particular functions. You do not need to be moving your mouse over to the toolbar for these things because you do them so often. it's a waste of time. Now let's go back just briefly to the subject of zooming. A relatively new feature addition to Photoshop is this scrubby zoom concept. Uh, I'm just going to say one thing about this, which is don't use it. It's kind of cute. I sort of, it's kind of fun being able to do this kind of number, but realistically, it just cannot possibly be as fast as just bringing up your zoom tool and just drawing a box around the thing that you want to zoom into. Boom, you're done. Now, as with the other modifier keys that are used for document navigation and that sort of thing, you should also be well versed in the selection-based modifier keys. So we already discussed shift. You've got things like command arrow to start moving things around, command shift arrow to move them 10 pixels at a time. You got the ability to add option to either of those things to start copying. The option key can be used both to remove chunks from your selection as well as to draw from the center, to draw a selection from the center of where you're clicking. One little trick that can come in handy that a lot of people don't know about is the ability to hold option and shift to have two overlapping sections only leave behind the areas where they're overlapping. So I already had one marquee drawn, and now I'm drawing another marquee that overlaps with that one. And as you'll see, it will only leave behind the chunk that was overlapping. Now here's a modifier key usage that's very near and dear to my heart, and I really wish they had it in Illustrator, but alas, it is only in Photoshop right now, and that is the ability to temporarily turn off snapping. So as you'll see here, if you look closely, you'll see that as I get close to this guide, I'm getting a snapping behavior. That's all well and good if that's what you're actually wanting. But if you're not, if I'm actually trying to grab just a couple of pixels near the guide without having the guide have anything to do with it, all I have to do is hold down the control key briefly, and as you'll see, that snapping behavior is gone, which makes it a lot easier to get a very pixel-specific selection. You just let go of the control key and your snapping behavior returns. Another modifier key behavior that comes in handy with a number of different tools is the ability to hold the command key to toggle between two different modes of that tool. So in the case of the move tool, we have the auto select behavior. You can do it either way by holding the option key, the command key down rather. When you do that, it toggles whatever that state is. So in my case, I have it turned off by default, but if I hold the command key down and I have this tool, the move tool selected, then it switches that behavior to jump to this layer instead. So now I'm on this layer, and then I can do the same thing to go back to this layer. And then I can move that one. For the web designers out there, this little trick also works with the slice tool. Typically you have two modes. You've got slice selection and slice creation. But if I hold the command key down, it switches briefly to the slice selection tool. And the same will happen if we switch, so that we've got the selection tool first, but if we hold the command key down, then we get the slice creation tool. Similar but different is the usage with the lasso tool. So with the lasso tool, if I hold the command key, what's actually going to happen when I click is that it's going to finish the selection. That's all well and good, but if we want to do the same thing we were doing earlier, which is to switch between two important modes of that tool, then we can use the option key with the lasso tool. What that does is that allows us to switch from the sort of rubber banding polygonal tool to the regular lasso tool that suddenly allows me to start actually just drawing. As soon as I let go of that option key, it switches back to the polygonal version, and I can finish my selection that way. So those are the modifier key usages for a lot of the tools that you're going to be needing to use on a regular basis. There are plenty of others, of course. I don't have time to cover them all. And if there are other tools in Photoshop that you use very frequently, then I would encourage you to see what the modifiers do. All you have to do is just sort of play with them and just see what happens when you use those keys. Let's move on to single key commands. So here again, you probably know a few of these. You probably know that M is for the marquee tool. You probably know that V is for the move tool. Hopefully you know that I is for the eyedropper tool. So I'm not going to go through all of these, of course, but here again, you're really going to be doing yourself a favor if the tools that you use very frequently, you go ahead and just memorize the single key command. It's not that difficult to memorize those particular things, and it's going to save you a lot of time down the road hunting for that tool. Now, one important trick that applies to a lot of these tools is that much in the same way that the command key will temporarily bring up a different mode for a given tool, the Shift key will work in conjunction with the single key commands to flip between multiple modes of that tool. So for example, if we pay attention to the marquee tool, you'll see that right now I've got the elliptical marquee selected. But if I hold down Shift and click M, it'll flip between these other modes. Now, this is actually not the default setup. These two single row and single column modes are not set with the M key by default. But here again, if you go into your keyboard commands and you select Tools, you'll see that you can actually modify even the single key commands for your tools. Now, I don't recommend you do a lot of that. I don't really recommend that you change the modifier keys outright unless there's a tool that you really use a lot and you really want to have easier access to it, then by all means go ahead. But the main reason that I would think it would make sense to come in here would be to add more of the same letter to other modes of a tool that you use a lot. So, one example here is this mixer brush tool. I don't actually use that. I don't even know what that is. But the point is, if that was something you used frequently, all you have to do is click here and then just put a B in there and hit accept. And the next time you go back to your brushes, you'll see that now the mixer brush tool is one of that whole set of Bs. So now when I hit B, I'm going to toggle through all 4 of those modes. Some single key commands that are not directly associated with tools but are very important as well include D, which switches to black and white color chips with black in the foreground, X, which flips those 2 color chips, F to flip between the 3 major window modes, also using the number keys at the top of your keyboard to quickly adjust the opacity level. You can use them in quick succession to get a very exact opacity level like 47. You can also hold the Shift key to change the fill level. Hitting the Q key will enter and exit the quick mask mode, while hitting the / key will toggle the lock on layer opacity. Let's talk about a few other beneficial key commands. Command 0 will show you your entire canvas, while Command Option 0 will normally zoom to 100%. It's not going to work right here because I actually have that mapped to Command 1. Just as with Illustrator, holding Command and hitting the left and right brackets will move the current layer selection up and down. You can also use Command Option G to group the current layer with the underlying layer. And you can create a new layer by hitting Command Shift N, which will bring up the layer naming field. I prefer this method. If you really want to create a layer with no name, you can add the Option key to that, which will just create new layers all day long. Let's look at adjusting text with key commands. Here again, you're probably going to know a lot of these, but let's just go over them really quickly. Selecting all the text, Option up and down arrow is going to adjust leading. Option left and right is going to adjust tracking or kerning, depending on what you have selected. A quick tip here, you can use Command H to hide your selection while still keeping that text selected. My F1 hotkey does not work in this context. Option Shift up and down will adjust the baseline of the text. Now here's another one that comes in really handy, not just in Photoshop, but in lots of other applications, including most of the Adobe applications. That is, if you hold the Shift key while you hit the Enter key, then it will create a soft return inside of the paragraph that you're currently working in. So if you happen to have paragraph spacing created, so that normally when you hit a return, it creates a whole other paragraph with additional spacing in between. Here, you can hold the Shift key and hit Enter so that doesn't happen. A couple of quick tips with the brush tool. You can use the brackets to quickly change the size of your brush. So we can go from that to something much smaller. Now one feature here that I want to make sure that you're aware of is that if you hold the Option key while you have the brush selected or any drawing tool, you can quickly sample a color from the document and then start painting with that color immediately. But back to brush size, another cool trick that I learned recently is if you hold Control and Option and you click and drag up or down, you can adjust the hardness of your brush, and if you go left and right, you can adjust the diameter of the brush. So let's move on to another important section, and that is custom commands. Now custom commands can be thought of in 2 groups. They can be thought of the sort of commands that you change or add from within your keyboard shortcuts panel. So if, for example, we are in the applications menu, we want to add let's say we want to add a key for duplicate layer. We can come in here and let's just say we want it to be Command Option Shift D. It's going to give me a warning here to tell me that that is currently being used for duplicate layer group, and I can either accept that change or undo the change. That's one way of looking at the key commands. Other custom key commands involve just using the F keys at the top of your keyboard. Now, you can use those in the same way. You can open up that keyboard panel and use an F key to assign it, but you can also use the F keys for your actions. The actions, of course, we'll talk about those in a moment. They are multi-step, tend to be multi-step processes. But you can assign, as you can see, I've got lots of F keys assigned to these particular actions. Now, as I've mentioned before in the course, you don't want to go hog wild with assigning a whole bunch of new key commands to your system, because there's a good chance that you're not going to remember them. I recommend that you only take on, one or two a day and try to commit to remembering to use that key command for that day, and then there's a good chance that you'll keep using it for the rest of your life. Obviously, you want to try to be logical with the way that you're assigning these functions when you can. You want to use a key on your keyboard that's somehow associated with that function so that it makes logical sense. One way that you can help increase the logic behind the use of the function keys is to sort of pile multiple functions in the same group of functions. Let's say, for example, it was blurring. If you had different types of blurring that you commonly do, then you might assign multiple blurring steps to the same function key by using modifier keys in conjunction with that key. So F5 might be a Gaussian blur, which so happens to be what it is on my keyboard. And then Shift F5 might be a smart blur. Here again, that happens to be my actual key for that. Both the Command and Shift modifier keys can be used in this way to create additional, so that way you can create up to 4 different commands by virtue of having the F key with Shift, the F key with Command, and the F key with Command and Shift. You can have 4 different commands associated with the same key. So that can actually help simplify it. I'm not suggesting that you have 36, or rather 48 functions assigned to your function keys, but I am suggesting that you try to adopt a strategy to the way that you're doing that so that they're not all just totally random, because that's another good formula for forgetting them down the road. Okay, so since we have the actions palette here, let's start talking about actions. For the uninitiated, actions again are it's sort of a recorded series of steps, and the actions can be really powerful. Those steps can be variable. They can in some contexts they can be different depending on what's happening at a given time. Actions can have really any number of steps that you want them to have, and this is a place where you're going to benefit from actions by trying to take an objective look at things that you do on a regular basis, multi-step things. So a good simple example here is the fact that when I'm opening a photo, or I just have some kind of photographic imagery in my PSD, I will very often want to assign a hue and saturation adjustment layer and a levels adjustment layer to that artwork. Well, I've already created an action for that, so if I hit Shift F9, there they are. I don't have to go and like click down here and say, yeah, hue and saturation and then levels. That would be a major pain in the butt. Now, the easiest way to create an action is to just record it. That's one of the beauties of actions, is that Photoshop will watch what you're doing, it'll record what you're doing, and then you just hit stop on the recording method, and you're done. So let's just create a simple example here to show you. We're going to click the new actions button. We're going to call this test. And as you can see, the first thing you're going to hit there is record. Once we do that, we're in recording mode. So the action that we're going to do here is we're just going to create a selection. We're going to copy that into its own layer, and then we're going to invert it. As you'll see, it's building those steps as I'm doing those functions. So then all we do is just hit stop, and our action is complete. If we want to test it, we can go back to our background layer here. We don't make a selection, because let's just turn off the one above that, and we can just click on test and hit play, and you'll see that it'll do all those things pretty much instantaneously. Okay, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about file organization. Cleanliness is fluidliness. You want your files to be as organized as possible to take advantage of the folders and subfolders that you have at your disposal, to make sure that everything is actually sort of logically organized. This is going to make your life a lot easier if you can get in the habit of doing this. Not only because you'll be able to see in your layers palette what's what, but also because you can easily close folders and that sort of thing to get things out of your way. When if you use the feature where you can right click using the move tool to select a layer, it's actually tells you what those things are rather than having to just take guesses or poke around looking at a bunch of layers that are called untitled layer. I wish I didn't have to browbeat people about this, but I've just seen too many PSDs come across my desk that are just a train wreck. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's very easy for us to deal with this, but by every time we need a new layer, we just hit Command-Shift-N. That way we are able to type the title in right away, and then it's a done deal. But it's also very easy to just double-click any given layer title and type whatever you need to type. So here I have open a somewhat old PSD. This is for a winery client of mine. And as you'll see, if we open up a couple of these, we've got subfolders inside of some of the folders. That helps to further categorize the information and make it easier to deal with, easier to get out of the way so that we can concentrate on other things. And then you'll also see in some cases, we've got things that are grouped together. We've got layers grouped on top of base layers. That's there not just, in some cases it's just to control opacity or that sort of thing, but it's also sometimes just to help get things out of the way. If you know that these layers are always going to relate to this layer that's beneath them, then there's no reason not to go ahead and group them together. That's all I have to say about that, but keep your files clean. Let's move on to tool presets. Now this is something that I don't use a whole lot, but in the places that I do use it, it comes in really handy. Most of the tools, almost all the tools, maybe all the tools, I'm not sure, have this little menu up here that allows you to save the configuration of that tool. And it doesn't matter how simplistic the tool is, if it has options, it probably allows you to save that configuration. But in any case, we've got our magic wand selected, and this is a really good example of why this is helpful. So sometimes when I'm working with maybe some web imagery or whatnot, I might want what I am referring to as a flat wand. That's a magic wand that literally just, this is not a good image to use this on, but it literally just picks up all of one color. That's all it does. It doesn't have anti-aliasing turned on. It doesn't try to grab anything other than just one simple color region. So if, for example, we have this filled with black, then our flat wand will grab that black. It won't grab anything else. That comes in handy sometimes. Other times, I want my basic 30 wand. All that is a basic wand that does have anti-aliasing turned on, and it also has a tolerance of 30. So, it's just kind of a basic tolerance that will grab a number of things. I'm going to turn on contiguous there so we can just grab this one region. But, I'm not going to teach you how to use the magic wand. You know how to use that. But the point is that I need that magic wand set up in exactly that way very frequently. And so it just makes it a lot faster for me to be able to do that. Now, your custom styles are not exactly the same thing, but I'm going to roll them into this section because they have kind of energetically a similar benefit, similar usage. So much in the same way that we have our setups for our tools, it also really helps to have specific setups for particular types of effects that we use. Now this is not going to be as useful these days in the days of flat design. So we have less use for drop shadows and bevels and that sort of thing, which is fine. I'm not objecting to that stylistically. I think that's fine. But in any case, sooner or later we will probably want a drop shadow for something. So let's create a new layer here, and we'll give it red. So the nice thing about having these preset styles down here is that I can just click on a starter shadow, and this isn't the best layer to be testing this against. Let's just fill this with white. So we can barely see here that there's a little bit of a shadow behind this red box. And all that's really doing for me is that I created a shadow that's fairly subtle and that will be a good baseline, something to start with. In some cases, it may be all I need, but in most cases, it's just going to sort of get me started. One of the reasons I created this is because the default drop shadow in Photoshop is terrible. It's like 75 or 80% opacity. It's not realistic at all. That is everything that I am able to think of at the moment, but you should probably check back every a few months or so and just see what I've added, because I will almost certainly have added or changed a few things. And it's also just good to come back and just do a recap of some of these things. Be sure to read and follow the action steps after the video. This is an important one. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.